It's just like we're having a conversation with each other.
I know, because when do we like how do we know if it started?
I think it started.
Oh, it started. Hi.
Hey everyone, I'm Becca Aronson, the Director of Product at Chalkbeat and your instructor, and I'm here today with Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma Kruger-Grovum. I'm a product specialist who works in New York City and also does Newsroom consulting. And I'm another one of the instructors.
So we're really excited to have our first Facebook Live, Google Hangouts Live session with all of you. Please leave your questions in the comments on the YouTube video and they'll be passed along to us and we can answer them. In the meantime, we were thinking that a great use of this time together would be to walk through the worksheet that you are working on for this first week and kind of explain how you can use this as a tool to start thinking like a product manager. So for reference, Cindy Royal, who you'll be seeing in the later weeks interviewing other product leaders, she and I teamed up for a workshop at ONA, the Online News Association conference last year, to lead a session to get people to start thinking about product differently in their newsrooms. So we designed this worksheet to be a really quick 1-hour run through to get you to do a lot of different exercises that a product manager would probably do over 6 months. So it's really just to get your toes wet in a lot of different areas where you can think a little bit more holistically about a problem as you approach it. So Emma, I was thinking that you and I could actually go through this exercise together because I think it's really much better when you have a conversation with someone.
Sounds good. Who do you want to be?
Well, let's start with the challenge. So the reason why we started off with a challenge is I'm sure you know from experience that oftentimes people will come to you with a fully formed idea. They're like, I want to start a membership program, or I want to launch a new newsletter. And one of the first things that I usually do when someone comes to me with a big idea is say, well, what is the problem that you're trying to solve with this new product? Like, what is the challenge that you've identified? Maybe you want to diversify the news organization's revenue because you realize that as a business, you're too dependent on advertising. And so you want a membership program to bring in more money. But that would really impact the design of the membership program or the design of what it is you actually want to do. So I'm curious, Emma, do you have a challenge you think we should tackle?
Sure. Why don't we think about how to launch a new newsletter?
Yeah, I think that's great.
That like a lot of people will have either come across in their newsroom or have been thinking about for 2019. And so I think that a lot of people, it'll be applicable.
Yeah. So what is maybe one of the challenges that you want to address with a new newsletter? Maybe it's reaching a niche audience.
Yeah, like how would you do like a newsletter around either like a beat or a specific topic or a specific writer?
Cool. All right, let's imagine, since I work for Chalkbeat and we write about education, let's imagine that we want to design a newsletter that's specifically targeting parents of K through 12 children. Because we feel like the challenge is that those people aren't engaged enough with news about their local school policies. So they don't really have the information they need to make informed decisions about where to send their children to school or how to make more equitable education outcomes for everybody.
Cool.
Clearly, you guys know where my mind is.
Yeah. So how do we know that that audience is not currently being served?
I think that's a good question. So the next step in the worksheet is to draw a picture of someone in your target audience. I don't think we can do that on a video, sadly, but we could describe them.
Sure.
So Emma, what do you think like the habits or the characteristics of this person would be?
This is probably somebody who has children in school.
Neither one of us has children in school, so we're just gonna imagine here.
So maybe they use the internet like in very targeted times during the day, like when they put their kids to bed at night, they check the internet and they get their news that way.
Yeah.
So that could be one habit that I would think of for this user.
Yeah. I imagine this person is very busy and that they have a lot of routines, especially around getting their kids ready for school in the morning, and coming home after school, like what they do to get their kids dinner. They're probably just really busy.
Right.
Do you think this person has any time to work out? I have no idea.
I don't know. Or like how they use their commute time.
Yeah, how do they use their commute time? That's a really good question. I don't know.
I guess is their kid a talker? Right? Like, are they engaging with their child, or are they engaging with like the radio?
Mm-hmm.
Something.
Yeah. That's great.
So if I were this kind of user, I would maybe want to be able to quickly learn about the schools in my area, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if the newsletter is the right format for this person.
And maybe like an Audible product or something.
Yeah, like what is a way where we could reach them on their commute, or find them in those times when they're less busy and engage with them. Or maybe it's just a matter of figuring out when to send the newsletter so that we reach them in those times when they're most likely to be on their phone.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea too.
Okay, so the next stage in our process is to write a user story. So as a parent, I want some goal, so that some reason why I want this. I think you and I kind of already talked about this a second ago with our challenge statement, which is, as a parent, I want more information on what's happening in local education issues so that I can make better decisions for my family.
Yeah.
It will be one user story. Cool. All right. Part 2. So now that we have a good idea of who we're making a newsletter for, we should think about why our news organization would want to create this product, and how we can make a case to others that it might be worth the investment. So usually the starting ground that I do for these kinds of things is market research or a competitive review. Like, who else is in this space doing something like this, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of the product? I think this is really good because it means we can identify either a way to differentiate ourselves, so that we have a space within that market, or serve a unique need that isn't being filled by other people right now.
Mm-hmm.
I should know off the top of my head of other newsletters for parents, but I don't.
Well, like, think about other newsletters that are built for busy people, right? Like the Skim is meant to be like a light read for people who like don't have a lot of time in the morning, right?
That's great. That's a great example.
Like, that is like one model.
Or like The Daily, which is a podcast so you can get your one big news story of the day from the New York Times.
Yep.
Which I love. I listen to it every morning. Cool.
So the next says, how will your product contribute to your business goals? And so I think that if in our theoretical chalkbeat adjacent newsroom, I think that, you know, reaching parents is probably a like very monetizable audience, right? So if you are serving a specific like demographic of parents in particular, you could probably collaborate with your direct sales team to put together some kind of like local schools, local ads situation.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely important to think about that from the sponsorship angle of like how having more engagement with this specific audience could lead to more revenue.
Mm-hmm.
The other big goal is sometimes like our big goal is driving impact, right? Like, how do we make the most impact with our journalism? And a key ingredient for that is having a relationship with the community, because they're the ones who actually take action that has impact. If parents care about education issues, then they're more likely to be at a school board meeting and voice an opinion that could change the outcome of things. So we could make an argument that reaching this audience in a more targeted way contributes to this nonprofit mission that we have, in addition to creating more opportunities for revenue.
Is that you, the bells?
Sorry, that jingling noise was my dog.
Oh, I thought it was like a bracelet or something.
No, he's just shaking. If he comes over to me, I'll lift him up and you guys can see my dog.
How would we measure the success for this product, do you think?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, are we reaching parents?
Yeah. And then are they taking action, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the newsletter includes like a, hey, did you learn something from this newsletter that you're going to take action on? Like, don't forget to shout out Chalkbeat adjacent newsroom when you go to the PTA or whatever. Like
Yeah,
maybe there's
or
some
like,
feedback loop, or there's a hashtag that you encourage them to use when they're sending their angry mom tweets or angry dad tweets.
yeah. I think also a really cool thing we could do is like if we're encouraging them to attend a school board meeting or event, we can actually then go to that event and see how many parents showed up and talk to them and then use their quotes in the next newsletter, or like represent our readers in some way. Um, I think this is getting a little off of like, what does success look like? But I think what we're saying is success looks like highly engaged readership
Right.
that is interacting with us. Um, Probably low churn. Like you want
Yeah.
people who sign up for your newsletter and actively read it and then don't unsubscribe.
Good
Um,
forwards.
Good forwards and referrals.
Yep.
People sign up their friends. Probably also a workflow question, right? I think a lot of times people underestimate how much time goes into making newsletters and new products. So maybe success also means that it's a streamlined workflow in our newsroom so that it's not creating extra work for people. And instead, it's an easily incorporated part of our process.
That makes sense too.
Yeah. That kind of leads us into the next part, technology. So technology, I think, also goes with resources. For small newsrooms, um, it's often not about what technology would make things possible. It's what technology and resources you simply have access to. And sometimes that's also just personnel and staff hours. Like, what is your team's bandwidth? So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that it's not just because some people can do AI or VR that should be what you're doing in your newsroom. Sometimes this question is a little bit more limited for newsrooms.
And then I think also it's always about what can you build that's recyclable, right? So maybe you're thinking about how could we launch this specific parenting newsletter, but actually the question you want to be asking is how can we make it easier to spin up new newsletter products?
Definitely. We also got a great question from someone, from Kathy. She asked, how would you determine whether parents need this newsletter? And would you conduct a survey among parents? What's the most effective way to do that? That's a great question. Um, I think one thing to keep in mind when you're developing new products is that you don't have to have all of your answers from the moment that you make something a live product. You might start off with what you think parents need, and then as you go, ask for information from them and use your analytics and metrics to gauge whether things are effective. So maybe you would just have a survey of people who have been reading your newsletter for 6 weeks, who have opened it consistently, and ask them, like, what value are you getting out of this newsletter? Do you really like the feature about upcoming events? Do you really like the feature about headlines curated from other news organizations? What are the things that are really helpful to you, and what do you wish that this newsletter had, or what is not helpful to you? That would be a good way to start off with. Surveys are always great, but they're also sometimes limited. So it's also good to look at your open rate data, any analytics and metrics that you have, to gauge like what people are actually interacting with.
Right. People have a really hard time describing what it is that they want relative to their actual behaviors. And so that's why like open-ended survey questions can only get you so far.
Yeah.
Data is better when you can get it.
That's such a good point. Yeah, it's also hard not to write leading surveys. I think sometimes we really want to assume we know, and keeping them really limited, just like I open this in the morning or in the afternoon, doesn't seem like it provides that much value, but it's a delicate balance. Okay, let's go back to this question of technology. So we're building a newsletter. What technology or resources do we need to create and maintain this product? Oh, good question.
I guess it depends on how the rest of your newsletters are set up. If you can just like easily just do like a copy paste and roll out a new template, or if do you need a new logo from design? Do you need a new list? Are you starting from scratch? Are you going to, oh, hi.
Henry's joining us now. This is Henry, everyone.
Hi, Henry. So things like that. Like, do you need someone to add it to the website, right? Like to update the newsletter page that says we now have this newsletter. Do you need someone to do like lead generation through social media cards or something like, like you have to hook up those types of things?
Yeah, I think this area, like if let's say you're in a newsroom that has never written a newsletter before, which for some reason I doubt anyone is at this point, but you never know. Sometimes you also have to do a competitive review of what technology other organizations are using so you can figure out what works best for you. Mm-hmm. You might want to choose something that a lot of other news organizations are using, for example, MailChimp, because then you can get support from colleagues at other news orgs, and it's easier to hire people from other newsrooms who have experience using that tool. But maybe it doesn't serve your unique business needs, and so you need to take that into consideration. Like maybe you have another platform or system that you want to integrate it with, and MailChimp just wouldn't work very well. Yeah. Technology is complicated. This is also, I think, when we would ask questions like, what are the different approaches that we could take? Like, do you want to create a more automated newsletter that just collects stories from your RSS feed that are tagged with things that parents might like? Or do you want to give it a personal touch with like a narrative?
Mm-hmm. I think when you look at the strengths and weaknesses of different ways you could implement it, is it going to be like an ongoing newsletter? Is there going to be someone to staff it? What happens if the technology breaks down and there's a gap in service? Do you have like a fallback plan for sending the newsletter manually? Things like that.
Yeah, that's really good too. I mean, strengths and weaknesses, like I think just knowing how often you're gonna be able to publish a newsletter, whether it's weekly, monthly, bi-weekly, really depends on the bandwidth of your staff and how many features you decide to include. I mean, if you're trying to, let's take the example of we want to curate an events calendar. If we just want to show upcoming school board meetings, maybe that's okay because we can get an automated list of events from the district, or that's, fairly easy. But, say you want to add a parent teacher night and that's by school and they have different nights. How much effort would it be for your reporter to gather that information? Is it worth the time? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I think that becomes a question that you need to consider with everyone who's involved. Yeah. At this point, though, when you start getting to those kinds of questions, like looking at the strengths and weaknesses and different features, that's when I think it's really good to have this conversation about priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the original problem that you're trying to solve and say, like, which features are going to most deliver a solution towards that problem that we're trying to solve. Like if the problem that we're trying to solve is we need more diverse revenue, then maybe you want to prioritize features that are going to create opportunities for sponsorship or that advertisers will want to get behind. Not only that, obviously, but that might be important for your product. If it's not about revenue, maybe it's more about engagement. You want to have more interaction with your readers, things like that.
Mm-hmm. It's good to have good goals, and kind of looking at like what metrics you'll look at, like how will you know if you've been successful? Are you going to look at things like list growth, or are you going to look at things like open rate or click-throughs, or if you're doing like an engagement loop, is it, you know, number of times people have tweeted selfies of themselves at school board meetings using your hashtag, something like that, that's quantifiable.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to have parents at school board meetings tweeting things. Oh, look, we got another question. Rachel Thomas asks, would you encourage public prototyping to test feature options? And would that increase your engagement efforts by using public prototyping to encourage your audience to give feedback?
Oh, interesting.
What do you think, Emma?
I usually have done public prototyping with like colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
So like not that they aren't real people, but not like public people, like strangers. Or in my last job, I worked in a building that had a lot of other tech companies in it. So like if you went to like the communal lunchroom, you could get like other people who use the internet frequently for their jobs, but not specifically for our same job. And you could kind of run paper prototypes past them. And that was like really useful, but we never really did a lot of like actually public facing prototypes.
Yeah, we did this thing when we were rebuilding the Texas Tribune website that I called guerrilla user testing. And I got a bunch of people involved from throughout the newsroom, not just the people who are working on rebuilding the website. And we just went out for a happy hour at like 4:30 with our laptops to bars that had Wi-Fi, and would just go up to people and ask them to use the website.
Interesting.
And we had a script. You know, I talked to people ahead of time and kind of trained them on what we wanted to ask people, but it was mostly about just like talking to people as they used it and seeing what worked or didn't work, or what they thought overall about the design. And it was really great because it helped us get people from throughout the staff involved, and feel like they had a part in it and give them a chance to like interact. It was cool. I mean, it was always cool to meet people that were like, oh yeah, I know this publication that you work for, and I'd love to give you feedback, and this is great. It just feels really good, and you do learn some things about what you're working on.
Yeah. I agree that using your coworkers to like, inviting them to join you is a really good way to kind of foster the cross departmental like collaboration that we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think your point though about just making paper prototypes for your newsroom is also really good to get people involved in these early stages, because they might point out things that you don't see too. Like, you might be thinking that this one feature you're planning to build is super freaking cool, and then they tell you some disruptive fact about that. Like
You're worried,
oh,
too big? Is this button too small? Is this button the right color? And they're like, what button?
yeah. Or they're like, oh, the government agency that you think you're gonna be able to get that data from is like notoriously hard to work with, and they will probably do everything they can to prevent us from easily integrating this data into our application or something like that. And then it's just like, oh, okay. Reporters often have really valuable knowledge about things like that that is good to take into account. All right, let's write our SMART goal. We're going to talk a lot about SMART goals in the third week, but for anyone who doesn't know, SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, results-driven, and time-bound. There are other versions of this, but basically it just means you want a specific goal so that you can actually achieve it. If you're just like, I'm going to lose weight, everyone knows that you don't lose weight. But if you have an action plan of how you're going to do that in a time frame, you're more likely to actually hit your goal. Should we stop for a second and go back to this question from a user? We got another one.
Yeah.
So Claudia asks, I don't know if you already talked about this, but what do you think about A/B tests for newsletters, and what advice do you have for doing it? We have not talked about A/B testing.
We have not talked about A/B testing, but we can.
Yeah, Emma, what do you think about A/B testing?
I think it really works, right? Like it works if you have a big list for newsletters, right? So you have to remember that most people are going to do something like a 10-10-80 split where like 80% of the people are going to get normal, right? And then you'll have a 10-10 split with the A and the B options. And so if you have a really small newsletter list, that 10% split gets real small real fast. And so it's hard. It's really hard to make sure that you have enough people in that window to receive both sides of the coin. But the data can be super helpful. We used to do them at the Daily Beast for some, like, if we were like testing small homepage modules, like little tweaks to the homepage, we would give like 10% of the audience would see an A and 10% would see a B, and then the rest of the people would just see nothing.
Yeah, I think that the key to A/B testing is making the difference significant enough that you can actually tell that it was statistically significant. The thing you changed was what caused the difference in result. So with newsletters, subject lines are a really great thing to A/B test, because if people open it, it's because they saw the like that's the only thing they really see.
Right.
A/B testing on websites gets a little bit more complicated. It's obviously super valuable, but you have to really think about the scope of what you're testing and the measurement that you're using to make sure that that isn't too broad. There are a lot of factors.
I think you're right. Newsletters are a good like entry point for newsrooms if they're not familiar with the concept of A/B testing, if they're nervous about that, or if they're, feeling a little timid and they want to start with a small experiment. Doing a headline swap is a really good way to check that and try it out.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Headlines and A/B testing, and some of the tools that newsrooms are using now make that a lot easier. Cool. All right, so let's write our SMART goal for our newsletter. So the example that we have on here is we will produce a 3-minute daily podcast, distribute on Amazon Alexa, and gain 2,000 followers by the end of the first month. I put that on there as the example because it's absurd.
It's real aggressive.
It's an absurdly aggressive goal. There's no way anyone would be able to do that unless you're like the Washington Post. As someone who's worked in a small newsroom, that seems like an absurd goal. So for our newsletter,
we would maybe want to launch a weekly newsletter to start, with a goal of gaining 500 subscribers by the end of the first month.
Yeah, and I think that 500 number would probably depend on our market size.
Yeah.
Right? Like if we're in Dallas, our number might be more aggressive than if we're in Memphis, just because it's a way larger city.
Yeah.
But I like what you did there of putting a time frame on it and an exact number. Awesome. Cool. Well, that's the worksheet. Ooh, we got another question. Oh, no, it's a comment. So April says that she did a similar version of guerrilla testing, and she went to coffee shops and gave people a $5 gift card for their coffee. I think that's a great point, that if you can get your employer to give you little gifts and presents to encourage people to participate, that's awesome.
Swag, man.
I know, right? Yeah. Is there any more questions about this worksheet? As you can see, this isn't really putting together a pitch necessarily. It's more about making sure that you're starting to think through all these different stages. Like you can see how Emma and I just use this as a prompt to start this conversation. I think this would be a good thing. For example, if someone in your newsroom comes to you with a new idea, you can say like, well, let's like think through some of these things and just spend an hour talking about it. And then we'll have a better idea of like what we should do next, or how much time we need to put in different stages. This is really not something that you could be like, all right, and now I'm going to launch this newsletter.
I filled out the worksheet.
Yeah, it's more about just getting your brain going.
I'm looking at the same problem from different points of view. I think is really helpful to think about it from how is the editorial team going to make this come true? How is the technology team going to make this come true? How is the ad ops team going to make this come true? And then making sure that everyone's aligned in the same vision and that everyone is using the same metrics of success when you come out on the other side.
Yeah, definitely. And you're going to talk about that more next week too, and how to formulate a pitch.
Yep.
That'll be great.
More to come.
We got another question from Kathy. Is this form fluid? Should it be updated as the product is being developed? Yes and no, which is to say that you can use this worksheet however you want. If you find that you start a conversation with someone in your newsroom about building a product and it really takes off, by all means, keep updating this worksheet. Some of these stages, though, I would say would require their own memo. Like if you're really doing competitive research well, you're probably going to have some sort of table that compares the features of different tools you could be using, or including screenshots from other products about what they're doing well, so that you can communicate that out with your organization and get more consensus and buy-in about where your product fits, or what you're doing. This is really just one way of getting you started, but I would say a lot of these steps really would require a lot more work than you would do in this worksheet, unfortunately. But that's why we all have our jobs. Awesome. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up pretty soon. Are there any more questions from people who are watching?
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, this has been wonderful. Oh, look, we get one more question.
Ooh.
Do you focus on the audience you have or keep your aspirational audience in mind? Is there a way to transition between the two? This is a good question. I think that newsrooms often struggle with this. Like I found a lot of times newsrooms write for the insider audience that already knows their work really well, while the newsroom at large is like, we need to develop more of a reach strategy where we're reaching people who aren't as engaged with our work. So I think there's a balance, and one thing that can help is writing really clear user stories in that step of like, as a blank, I want this goal to be fulfilled through the product. Because then you can start to think about what are the different user stories for your current audience and your aspirational audience, and then use that to guide later decisions on what the product should be or the direction that you should go. I don't think that there is a clear answer here, right? I mean,
right. It comes down to whatever the goals are for the company and how your specific news product fits into that goal alignment. So if your top level goal for the year is retention, then loyalty and engagement come into play probably a little more than acquisition. But if your top level goal for the year is about revenue and acquisition and new audiences, then you could see where that user would be prioritized across the experiences. So it's really about making sure that you are pressing your leadership team to give you very clear vision, very clear goals, and prioritization of those, and so that everyone understands that there's always a give and take for every thing that gets shuffled around.
Yeah. And as we all know from working in newsrooms, getting clear goals and priorities is not always easy from the top of the organization. So the thing that you can do if you don't feel like you have a clear direction is really focus in on the user story part of this, or like what audience goal you're trying to reach. I just think that's important.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it can be hard to get that top-down direction. Cool. Well, I'm so glad that everyone could join us. Emma and I are both happy to be here. I'm going to speak for Emma. And it's been wonderful. So I think we'll be online. If you have any other messages, please join the forums. I'm so excited by all of the comments that are going in there. Please don't feel also like you have to post your own thread. Like read what other people have written and respond, and get more involved. There's a lot of people who are offering great examples of things that they're doing in their newsrooms already that we can learn from, and posing challenges that maybe you or your newsroom has some cool feedback that you might be able to offer them. So I hope everyone can read a lot of what other people are writing and really jump in there because it's some good stuff going on.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Farewell.